Last time, Antiochus IV Epiphanes had died unexpectedly in November of 164 BC, leaving his eastern campaign unfinished and a revolt ongoing in Judea. Before leaving for the east, Antiochus IV had taken the precaution of crowning his boy son as co-ruler, a contingency which now became relevant. Antiochus V, known as Eupator, meaning of a noble father, was only 9 or 10 years of age, and so was incapable of ruling in his own right. Lysias, who was the boy's guardian and tutor, had been appointed as regent while Antiochus IV was absent, and he now took the reins of the empire as a whole in the name of his young ward. Unbeknownst to Lysias, while Antiochus IV had been on his deathbed, he had given the imperial regalia to one of his companions, Philip, so they could be passed on to the new king. Philip understood this to be an appointment to the regency, and so was making preparations to return west with the royal expeditionary force in order to claim power for himself. For now, the oblivious Lysias was focusing on addressing the revolt of the Maccabees. Judas Maccabeus and his brothers had bested the Seleucids in several battles and now had de facto control over much of Judea, including Jerusalem itself. The one part of Jerusalem which still held out against the Maccabees was the Acra fortress in the city of David, which was defended by Seleucid soldiers as well as some Hellenizing Jews who would remain loyal to their Greek overlords, fearing reprisal from their zealous countrymen. This garrison continued to resist, but their situation was becoming increasingly dire, and so a small party managed to slip through the Maccabean cordon under the cover of darkness in order to request aid from Antioch. Judas Maccabeus himself had yet to force the ongoing issue of the Acra, as his attention was focused on the regions bordering Judea, where many atrocities had been committed against the resident Jewish populations. The various groups of Gentiles who made up the majority population in these border regions were wary of the newly resurgent Israel, and viewed the Jewish minority among them as a potential fifth column in the event of conflict. Thus, the peoples in bordering cities, such as Jaffa and Jamnia, engaged in massacres of their Jewish denizens. After hearing reports of this, in the spring of 163 BC, Judas and his brothers began a series of successful reprisal campaigns in every cardinal direction out from Judea. The Maccabean forces won numerous victories, pillaged Gentile lands, slaughtered many, and evacuated any remaining Jews to the safety of Judea. The only setback came when the two commanders who had been left to defend Judea itself, Joseph, son of Zacharias, and Azarias, felt that they were missing out on their share of the glory being won by the Maccabean brothers, and so they disobeyed their orders and attacked Jamnia. They were met by Gorgias, now serving as the governor of Idumea, who routed the Jewish force, killing 2,000 and sending the remainder running back to Judea. Between all these attacks and the ongoing siege of the Acra, the regent Lysias had determined to settle the matter once and for all through brute force. Unlike the smaller detachments, which earlier had been sent to restore Seleucid authority in Judea, this time Lysias had assembled a proper army. The first book of Maccabees claims that the regent had 100,000 infantry, 20,000 cavalry, and 32 elephants, which would be a true royal army on par with the largest forces the empire had ever raised. The second book of Maccabees states that Lysias and Antiochus V, each individually, commanded armies of 110,000 infantry, 5,300 cavalry, 22 elephants, and 300 scythed chariots. Josephus provides a smaller figure, with only 50,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, while increasing the number of elephants to 80. The scholar Bar Kokhba finds this latter figure plausible, although he believes that the number of elephants was more likely to have been 8. In any case, there was no army which the Maccabees could have mustered which would not have been dwarfed by this Seleucid force. Lysias entered Judea from Idumea in the south, taking the same route as he had during his abortive incursion of 164 BC, territory which had been proven safe to traverse, unlike the more hostile northern approach. This time he brought Antiochus V with him, so that the boy king could witness his first military campaign. Once more, Beth Sura was invested with a siege, and once more Judas Maccabeus rallied his men to the relief of the city. The people of the town resisted fiercely, setting Seleucid siege engines aflame in an attempt to secure time for the Maccabean reinforcements to arrive. This effort proved futile, and the town was taken just before Judas's army reached the area. Instead, the Maccabean force took up a defensive position between Beth Sura and Jerusalem, south of the town of Beth Zachariah, in order to prevent any Seleucid advance towards the Holy City. The number of men under Judas's command is unclear, but it was probably not much more than 20,000. The Maccabees were vastly outnumbered, but then, that was hardly a new experience for them. The site Judas chose to defend served to partially negate the Seleucid advantage in numbers, as it was here that the road led into a narrow defile. There was another road further east which Lysias and Antiochus could have taken to Jerusalem, but this route travelled through an even more severe gorge, and Maccabeus presumed that they would take the path of least resistance. This presumption proved correct, and the Seleucid army came into the plain before the defile, with their war elephants and gleaming armour presenting an imposing sight. Lysias sounded the attack, and his men marched forward, seeking to dislodge the Maccabean troops from the heights, while simultaneously assaulting the defile itself. Lighter troops made first contact, but the Jewish defenders at the pass resolutely held the line, with some 600 Seleucid soldiers being slain in this initial assault. The main battle line now approached. Eleazar Avaran, a younger brother of Maccabeus, upon seeing a war elephant about to bear down upon his comrades, and supposing that the extraordinary beast, decorated as it was with shining armour and a gilded howdah, must have borne King Antiochus himself, charged forward to confront it. The Maccabee single-handedly cut his way through the soldiers around the elephant until he was able to get underneath it. Then he cut up at the underbelly of the pachyderm, and with a thrust he brought it low. The elephant toppled over, bringing all its weight down upon brave Eleazar, who was crushed to death. Antiochus was not riding said elephant, and, being but a child, likely would have been far from the front lines. In the meantime, the Seleucid soldiers on the flanks, possibly composed in part of soldiers armed in a Roman manner, which would have been practical given the hilly terrain, had managed to force the Maccabean troops off of the heights. Despite having held at the centre, now that the heights had been lost, defeat was an inevitability for the Maccabean army, whose soldiers soon turned and ran. The day belonged to Lysias, and the way to Jerusalem was now open. Judas Maccabeus did not stay to attempt a defence of Jerusalem, but fled with some of his surviving men to Gophna, in the hills north of Jerusalem, where the rebellion had initially fomented. Those who did choose to defend Jerusalem faced a seemingly hopeless task. It had been a sabbatical year, so the fields had lain fallow, and thus the food stores of the city were extremely low, leaving it incapable of withstanding any prolonged investment. Now that Lysias had laid siege, a total Seleucid victory in Judea was in sight. Then something of a miracle occurred for the Jews. This time, deliverance did not come in the form of a white-clothed angel, but in the form of Philip and the remains of Antiochus IV's expeditionary force. A messenger bearing news came as fast as he could to the royal camp. Philip had not only finally returned from the eastern provinces, but sought to seize the regency of the kingdom, and shockingly, had already taken the capital of Antioch. This new crisis took precedence over all other things, so no more time could be spent besieging Jerusalem. Thus Lysias opened negotiations with the defenders of the city, and a deal for peace was quickly struck. The people of Jerusalem would accept Seleucid rule, and end their siege of the Acra fortress, and in exchange they were permitted to return to their ancestral practices without restrictions. As a sign of his goodwill, the young Antiochus offered a sacrifice to the god of Israel at the temple. The much despised high priest Malalas was removed from office, arrested, and was subsequently executed at Beroea in Syria. According to the second book of Maccabees, his death came through being suffocated in a pit of ash, a method of execution apparently pioneered by the Persians. A man named Alchemus was appointed as the new high priest, who, unlike Menelaus, was of the line of Aaron, and thus was much more acceptable to the general Jewish population. Nevertheless, the son of the deceased high priest Onias III, who was also called Onias, took umbrage with this, feeling that he had been denied his birthright as a descendant of Zadok the priest. He was offered sanctuary in Egypt by Ptolemy VI Philometor, who allowed the self-styled Onias IV and his followers to build a rival temple at Leontopolis. Despite the early defeat of his kingdom at the hands of Antiochus IV, Ptolemy VI maintained ambitions to reconquer Coele Syria and Judea, and having a high priest of his own to enthrone could prove a useful asset. Lysias and Antiochus began their march back to Syria. En route, they passed through Ptolemais, where an outraged population protested over the treaty with the Jews, as earlier in that year they had had their lands ravaged by a force of Maccabees and desired vengeance, not peace. Lysias was forced to personally address the furious mob, but through the skill of his oratory, he managed to calm them. As to what then occurred in Syria, little is known except for the outcome. Some struggle was had with Philip, but Lysias prevailed, and the usurper was executed. Antiochus, the daughter of Antiochus III and Queen Dowager of Cappadocia, had moved to Antioch along with her daughter, following her husband's death earlier in the year. After the defeat of Philip, both women were executed, seemingly on the orders of Lysias, which has led to scholarly speculation that she was either part of Philip's brief regime, or that she had attempted to assume guardianship over her nephew. In any case, Ariarathes V, her son, was incensed, but he could not risk offending the Seleucid government for fear that the remains of his beloved mother and sister would not be returned to him for burial. So an envoy was sent to Lysias to politely request their repatriation to Cappadocia, which was granted. The Romans had dispatched another group of commissioners to tour the eastern Mediterranean, who happened to arrive in Mazaka shortly after the reburial of Queen Antiochus. While Ariarathes had had to hold his tongue when dealing with Lysias, he now angrily complained to the Romans about the turbulent state of the Seleucid kingdom and the evil nature of its rulers. The king even went so far as to offer the commissioners an armed escort until such time as they had returned from Syria, but the proposal was politely declined. Antiochus IV had managed to maintain a positive relationship with Rome despite his often errant behaviour, thanks to his personal friendships with the Roman aristocracy and due to his own charismatic charms. These advantages had now been lost, and at the start of 162 BC, an embassy which was already predisposed against the Seleucids arrived in Antioch. This commission was made up of 3 legates, with the most prominent being Gnaeus Octavius, a man of some renown, having commanded the navy during the war against Perseus of Macedon, and having served as a consul for 165 BC. Octavius had no affection for the Syrians, and sought to enforce the authority of Rome onto the kingdom. His chief excuse for doing this was the Peace of Apamea, an agreement made a quarter of a century earlier with the current monarch's grandfather. By all rights, this treaty had long since been concluded, and no serious legal scholar would have attempted to enforce it, but Octavius sought to use it as a cudgel against the Seleucids. In all likelihood, this was not at the direction of the Senate, but was a plan the legate devised himself. The treaty had restricted the size of the Seleucid navy to 10 decked ships, but under Antiochus IV a new shipbuilding program had been undertaken, and so the commissioners set the new fleet ablaze while it was at anchor. The treaty had ordered the disbandment of the Elephant Corps, yet there was still an elephant stable, so Octavius had the hamstrings of the beasts cut, giving them a long and painful death. Their bellows of agony must have rung throughout the night. Lysias was fearful of Roman power in general, but in particular, he was afraid that Prince Demetrius, the son of Seleucus IV, who had long been a hostage in Rome, might be released and allowed to depose Antiochus V, thus removing the regent from power. Because of this, no protest was made, while Gnaeus Octavius publicly humiliated the Seleucid Empire. The citizens of Syria, however, were totally outraged, their anger directed both at the Romans for what they had done, and equally at their government for having done nothing. While Octavius was anointing himself with olive oil at the gymnasium of Laodicea, a local patriot named Leptines came upon the Roman and stabbed him to death. Leptines made no attempt to hide his deed and was hailed as a hero by his fellow citizens. In particular, a local grammarian by the name of Isocrates publicly praised the actions of Leptines, declaiming that Octavius got what was coming to him and that the other legates should have been killed also. This bubbling resentment against Rome seems to presage the later Vespers of 88 BC, when thousands of Romans across Asia Minor would be indiscriminately slaughtered by the Greeks. For Lysias, this turn of events must have been a waking nightmare. Not only had he lost the support of the people, but now the Romans had a very real reason to declare war. In a desperate attempt to placate Rome, Lysias gave Octavius a funeral, then dispatched ambassadors to the Senate to explain the situation and to deny all involvement in the assassination. The Romans were outraged at what had happened, but for the moment the Senate chose to bide their time, and in so doing would lose their chance to punish Lysias for his perceived crime. Prince Demetrius, the eldest son of Seleucus IV, had been a hostage in Rome since 178 BC. He lived a leisurely life, spending his time hunting boar with his hounds around Circeii, southeast of Rome, but this was little more than a gilded cage. When his father had died in 175 BC, Demetrius had been denied the right to take the throne, which was then usurped by his uncle Antiochus IV. When Antiochus V had come to power in 164 BC, again the prince petitioned the Senate to allow him to return to Syria, and again was denied. While it was recognized by all that Demetrius' argument for his release was morally and legally correct, it was in Rome's pragmatic interest the Seleucid Empire remain under the weak rule of a child. At about this time, Ptolemy VI, who had been temporarily deposed by his younger brother, arrived in Italy to seek aid from the Senate. The embarrassed pharaoh was penniless and dressed in common garb, walking to Rome on foot. Nevertheless, when Demetrius happened upon him on the road, he was still able to recognize his cousin. Rushing home, the prince gathered up fine robes, a diadem, and a gilt horse, all of which he presented to Ptolemy, so that the pharaoh could ride into Rome with all the bearing of a king. Ptolemy was appreciative, but declined his cousin's offer, no doubt counting on his pathetic appearance to win the pity of the Senate. A year or so later, when the obsequious ambassadors from Lycius arrived, bringing word of Gnaeus Octavius' murder, Demetrius' hopes were raised once more. He met with his friend Polybius and asked whether he should again petition the Senate for release. The historian advised against this, but recommended that the prince take a more daring course of action. Demetrius then asked the same of one of his closest companions, Apollonius, who, with the naive optimism of youth, believed that the Senate would surely now let him go. Demetrius once more addressed the Senate, but they maintained their earlier judgment. The prince conceded that Polybius had been correct, and that he would have to seize his own destiny. Demetrius' foster father, Diodorus, had only recently returned from Syria, and so he was able to tell his adoptive son about the state of things there, how the people were riled up against Lysias. He believed that simply by landing in Syria, the populace would proclaim Demetrius as their rightful king. Polybius contacted a friend of his, Malalas of Alabanda, who was an Egyptian ambassador, and brought him into their conspiracy. Malalas chartered a Carthaginian ship back home to Alexandria. Hardly a suspicious act, which was then loaded with provisions and made ready to launch. For his part, Demetrius initially only let 3 of his companions know of his scheme: Apollonius and his brothers Malaga and Menesthius. On the afternoon of the fateful day, Demetrius dined at one of his other friends' houses, where he announced his plans to go hunting at Anagnia on the morrow, before later proceeding on to Circeii. As dusk fell, Demetrius, fearful of becoming drunk, excused himself from the party, claiming to be ill, and departed with some friends to a hut outside of Rome. There, some more companions were admitted to the plot, who were instructed to head home, order their slaves to head to Anagnia with hunting equipment, and then return to rendezvous with Demetrius. Once the conspirators had all assembled, they made for the port of Ostia under the cover of darkness, reaching the Carthaginian charter at the end of third watch. There they were met by Malalas, who informed the shipmaster that due to circumstance he would not be able to return to Egypt, but would be sending these young soldiers as messengers on his behalf. The skipper had received his full pay in advance, so he was unconcerned about the change. At first light, the ship departed. Demetrius was finally on his way home. The escape of the prince was not immediately noticed. Those in Rome thought he was at Anagnia, while those at Anagnia figured he would meet them in Circeii. It was not until Demetrius had been absent for 4 days that a search was made, and by the 5th day the Senate met in an emergency meeting to discuss the matter. By this time, Demetrius had already passed the Straits of Messina with a favourable wind at his back. The Senate realised that they could not hope to recapture their hostage, and so they dispatched a commission headed by the elder Tiberius Gracchus to inspect affairs in Greece and Asia Minor, but most importantly, to observe from a distance the coming events in Syria. Demetrius arrived at Alexandria, where he hired a small band of mercenaries and then chartered ships to Phoenicia. In late 162 BC, after landing at the Tripolis, Demetrius assumed the diadem and was hailed as king by the people, just as Diodorus had predicted. As word of his arrival spread, elements within the army launched a coup in Antioch and placed under arrest Lysias, Antiochus V, and in some accounts, an unnamed younger brother of the king. As Demetrius entered the royal palace, the soldiers made to bring the prisoners before him. Before they could do so, Demetrius exclaimed, "Do not let me see their faces," and ordered the captives put to death. Despite Antiochus V's general unpopularity, the population cannot have seen the murder of a child as an auspicious way to start a reign. Yet, from the new king's perspective, it meant that he now had no possible challenges to his throne, that the usurping line of Antiochus IV Epiphanes had been extinguished. Or so he thought. Antiochus V's reign had been short and unremarkable. The successes of his administration had been the creation of a tenuous peace in Judea and the defeat of Philip, while on the other hand the spineless and meek compliance with Roman meddling had lost the empire some of the prestige which had been rebuilt by Antiochus IV. The accession of Demetrius, while welcomed in Syria, was not so enthusiastically embraced across the empire. Timarchus, who had been appointed as satrap of Media and Babylon by Antiochus IV, refused to accept the legitimacy of Demetrius's coup d'etat. As there was no rival candidate for the throne who the satrap could support, he simply assumed the diadem himself and declared the east of the empire as an independent kingdom. It was possibly around this time too that the vassal rulers in Persis, the Fraterarcha, began to style themselves as kings. Taking advantage of all this turmoil, King Artaxias of Armenia also shook off the Seleucid yoke and reasserted the independence of his kingdom, while Ptolemaeus, satrap of Commagene, declared the freedom of his mountain realm for the first time. Soon after taking the throne, the great king Timarchus sought to gain recognition from Rome. Roman support for his regime might deter Demetrius from suppressing his rebellion, and in the not improbable event of another Roman-Seleucid war, Timarchus could potentially annex large swathes of Seleucid territory. Heraclides, the former imperial treasurer and Timarchus' brother, was dispatched as part of an embassy to Rome. Armed with a bag of gold, Heraclides swayed many senators to his cause, and eventually the Senate was convinced to officially recognize Timarchus as a king. Timarchus then set to work securing control over his new realm through a series of military campaigns, and also forged an alliance with newly independent Armenia. Amidst all this instability, Demetrius sought to gain allies of his own. Ariarathes of Cappadocia appeared as a natural option, given that Demetrius had executed Lysias, who had been an enemy of Cappadocia. Yet, when Demetrius offered his cousin the hand of his sister Laodice, who had been the wife of the late Perseus of Macedon, the proposal was declined. Rather than uphold his dynasty's traditional alliance with the Seleucids, Ariarathes had decided to throw in his lot with the Roman Republic. The Cappadocian king sent ambassadors to Rome, who presented the Senate with 10,000 gold pieces, and recounted the renunciation of Demetrius. The Senate praised Ariarathes for this, and awarded him the honourable gifts of a sceptre and an ivory curule seat. Demetrius would not forget this public humiliation. As for Laodice, it is probable that she was the same Laodice who Demetrius would himself marry, although this is not certain. As his kingdom had become diplomatically isolated, Demetrius lacked suitresses suitable for his station, and so marrying his own sister, as his father had done, would have been a practical solution. Laodice would quickly provide her brother with an heir who was named after his father, and subsequently two further sons, Antiochus and Antigonus. Demetrius next sought to smooth over relations with Rome, who thus far had shown nothing but contempt towards him. Menochares, one of the king's companions, had been sent to meet with Gracchus, who at the time was in Cappadocia. This initial discussion proved fruitful, and further messages were sent to Gracchus when he was in Pamphylia and then when he was in Rhodes. By the conclusion of these exchanges, the Roman had become positively disposed towards Demetrius and was willing to advise the Senate to recognize his kingship. Menochares was then tasked with visiting Rome itself, but first a present had to be prepared for the Senate. Leptines, the murderer of Gnaeus Octavius, was ordered to be arrested, but he willingly turned himself over to the king, as he deludedly believed that he could convince the Senate that his actions had been divinely ordained. The firebrand Isocrates was also arrested, but he had to be taken by force, with a collar chained around his neck to hold him. From the time of Isocrates' arrest to his arrival at Rome, a year had passed, during which he had barely eaten, had not washed nor groomed, and had begun to lose his mind. Menochares presented the two prisoners to the Senate, along with 10,000 gold pieces. The Romans were terrified of Isocrates, seeing him now as being more beast than man. Leptines, on the other hand, was far more presentable. He spoke before the senators and openly admitted his deed, with no shame or fear. In the end, the Romans chose to accept the gift of gold, but declined to put the captives on trial, as they did not desire to absolve Demetrius and resolve the matter, instead wishing to maintain an active grievance against the Seleucid state. Nevertheless, on the advice of Gracchus, the Senate begrudgingly recognized Demetrius' position as king. Although it had not been an unbridled success, Menochares had achieved the primary goal of his trip to Rome. In the meantime, there was trouble in Judea once again. Judas Maccabeus had rebuilt his forces and renewed his insurgency, not wishing to accept the compromised peace of Lysias, but now seeking to gain full independence for the Jewish people. As with those in the east, Maccabeus saw the chaos in Syria as an opportunity to rebel against Seleucid hegemony. Alcimus, the freshly installed high priest of Jerusalem, had been forced to flee Judea for his own preservation. He arrived in Antioch to meet with Demetrius, desperate to obtain military support against the uprising. Bacchides, a general who had served under Antiochus IV, was given command over a sizable force, and was tasked with reinstating Alcimus. As Bacchides entered Judea, he encountered no resistance, with Maccabeus being as yet unwilling to risk a pitched battle. Alcimus was thus soon restored to his seat in Jerusalem. Before departing, Bacchides offered a false amnesty to the rebels, arresting and executing a number of those who surrendered. Believing that the authority of Alcimus had been clearly established, Bacchides returned to Syria. Yet, these killings had only served to permanently discredit the legitimacy of Alcimus in the eyes of many Jews, who continued to flock to the Maccabean cause. The high priest attempted to put down the insurrection himself, having his supporters kill supporters of the Maccabees wherever they could be found, but this proved to be an ineffective strategy. Once more, Alcimus travelled to the royal court, this time arguing that there could be no peace in Judea so long as Judas Maccabeus lived. Another, more moderate force was dispatched, this time under the command of a certain Nicanor, presumably the same man who had years earlier fought the Maccabees at the Battle of Emmaus, who was directed to bring Maccabeus to heel. At this point in the narrative, the second book of Maccabees diverges from the other surviving sources to recount a curious sequence of events. Nicanor and his forces entered Judea and repulsed some Maccabean troops led by Simon Thassi in a small battle at a village called Dessau. However, After this, the Seleucid general wished to resolve the conflict without further bloodshed, and requested to meet with Judas Maccabeus. After some preliminary oaths of friendship were arranged by intermediaries, the two men met, although Maccabean troops stood ready to spring into action at the first sign of treachery from the Seleucids. This proved unnecessary, as Nicanor and Judas became fast friends. The war in Judea ended for a time, with the Jew and the Gentile regularly strolling through Jerusalem, enjoying each other's company. Nicanor urged Judas to settle down, take a wife, and start a family, and so he did, being granted a position in the provincial government. Alcimus, driven by his hatred for Maccabeus, once again travelled to Antioch and bitterly complained that a traitor had been made an official of the state. Upon hearing the high priest's tale, Demetrius wrote to Nicanor, once again instructing him to arrest Judas Maccabeus. The Seleucid general had no choice but to carry out his duty, but he opted to bide his time until a suitable moment to spring a trap. However, Nicanor's ultimate intentions were betrayed by a sudden shift in his demeanour. Judas, who knew his friend well, quickly noticed this and fled into hiding. According to Josephus and the first book of Maccabees, Nicanor had simply tried and failed to arrest Maccabeus at their initial meeting, but from this point on, all the accounts generally are in alignment. Having failed in his task, an angered Nicanor marched to the temple and demanded that the priests reveal the location of Judas, threatening to level the sacred structure if they did not comply. The terrified clerics, who did not know where he was, prayed for deliverance. Soon news came that the Maccabees had gathered a new army, numbering around 2,000 to 3,000 near the village of Edessa, so Nicanor organised his own men and set off to do battle. The Seleucid force was 9,000 strong, so the Maccabees were clearly outnumbered, and Nicanor must have been confident of victory. On the Sabbath, Nicanor ordered an attack on the Maccabean position, but Jewish soldiers within his own force refused to comply, and thus the assault was postponed until the 13th of March, 161 BC. Prior to battle, Judas gave a speech to his army in order to inspire them, in which he told them of a vision he had experienced. The old high priest Athenaeus III had appeared before him and prayed for a Jewish victory. Then the prophet Jeremiah came to Maccabeus and bestowed upon him a gift from God himself, a holy sword of gold with which to strike down his adversaries. The spirit of the Maccabean army was uplifted by this address, and they had no fear of the coming battle, but were eager to gain glory and to save the temple from desecration. The Seleucids sounded their trumpets and advanced, while the Maccabees lifted up their voices in prayer. The action did not last long. Nicanor, bravely leading from the front, was one of the first to be struck down, and, lacking his leadership, his army was routed. The fleeing Seleucid troops were cut down without mercy, while Nicanor's head and arm were severed, which were then put on display outside of Jerusalem. Henceforth, on the anniversary of this battle, the holiday of Yom Nicanor was celebrated. The Maccabees once more took control over Judea, and Alcimus once more fled to Syria. In a similar manner to Timarchus and Ariarathes, Judas now sent two men, Eupolemus and Jason, as ambassadors to Rome. They succeeded in securing a treaty of friendship between the Jews and the Roman Senate, which served to further undermine Demetrius' authority over Judea. However, the focus of the Seleucid king's attention was not on the south, but on the rebellious satrapies of the east. News had come that Timarchus was making ready his forces to march on Syria and claim the imperial throne for himself, and so Demetrius mustered his own troops to finally combat this usurper. Their forces met near the crossing point over the Euphrates at Zeugma, and, while the details of the battle are not known, the result was utter defeat and death for the rebel king. Thereafter, Demetrius continued on into Babylonia, liberating the people there who had suffered under the misrule of Timarchus. The grateful populace hailed the king as Demetrius Soter, the saviour, and it is by this epithet which he would be remembered. In mid-160 BC, while affairs were being settled in the east, a new force was sent into Judea, once again under the command of Bacchides. in order to avenge the previous year's defeat and finally put down the rebellion. Rather than attack from the south, this time the invading army came from the north, marching through the Jordan Valley and then moving west from Jericho towards Jerusalem. By advancing via such an unexpected route, Maccabees was able to rapidly ascend to the Judean plateau unopposed, denying the Maccabean forces any opportunity to defend from the high ground. Rather than advance on Jerusalem immediately, Maccabees set up camp and began harrying the surrounding countryside. His goal now was not to merely take Jerusalem, but to provoke Judas Maccabeus and draw him into a battle where his rebellion could be wiped out once and for all. In this, Maccabees was successful, and the Maccabean army soon arrived to fight, encamping at a place called Elasa. The Seleucid force is reported to have stood at 20,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, a number which can be easily accepted. Larger than Nicanor's force, but smaller than a full imperial army, as many soldiers would have been on campaign with Demetrius in the east. The reported size of the Maccabean force, however, is far more questionable. The first book of Maccabees claims that Judas brought with him 3,000 men, but that all bar 800 fled before the battle, overawed by the size of the Seleucid army. Josephus' account simply revises the initial number down to 1,000 men. Given that the Maccabees had a year to build up their forces after the Battle of Edessa, and given the battlefield maneuvers which took place, such a small force is nearly unbelievable. Moreover, given Judas Maccabeus' experience and skill in undertaking guerrilla warfare, it is hard to think that he would have attempted to fight conventionally with so few men at his disposal. Bar Kokhba's modern account of the battle argues that the numbers provided by the surviving accounts deliberately downplay the size of the Maccabean force, and that in fact they would have fielded a similar number of troops to the Seleucids. Maccabees deployed his army in a fairly conventional manner, with his phalangites in the centre, with cavalry on each wing, and with his light troops ahead of the main body of soldiers. The general commanded from the place of honour on the right flank, accompanied by his best men. After a skirmish by the lights, the phalangites in the centre advanced on the Jewish position, but were met and, for the time, held by the Maccabean infantry. Judas now attempted to repeat the success he had had at Edessa, and charged with his men at Maccabees' position. The Seleucid general anticipated this, and feigned a retreat, drawing Maccabeus some distance away from the rest of his army. The Seleucid cavalry on the left wing saw the commotion and galloped to the aid of the right flank, hitting the overextended Maccabean troops in the rear, while Maccabees ceased his flight. Suddenly, the pursuing Jewish forces found themselves enveloped. Attacking ferociously, they attempted to break out of the trap, but their struggle was in vain, and they fell fighting, Judas Maccabeus among them. Once the death of their heroic leader became clear to the rest of the army, they turned and ran. The Seleucids had finally broken the back of the Maccabean rebellion. In the following days, Jonathan Aphus and Simon Thassi managed to recover the body of their brother, who they interred in their ancestral tomb at Madain, and there was much mourning across all the land of Israel. Maccabees once again restored Alchemus to the high priesthood at Jerusalem, and then set about eliminating the last traces of the Maccabees. Jonathan was chosen to take command of what was left of the rebel forces, but between Seleucid attack and a famine in the land, he was unable to rebuild the Maccabean army, and was forced to flee, first south into the Judean desert, then across the Jordan, out of Judea altogether. In the May of 159 BC, Alchemus ordered that a wall partitioning the inner court of the temple be torn down. Shortly after the work was begun, the high priest was struck down by a stroke, lost the ability to speak, and soon after died in agony. Maccabees, having sufficiently pacified and fortified Judea, was now content to withdraw the bulk of his men home to Syria, and chose to leave the contentious office of high priest vacant. Demetrius, having returned from securing the east, now looked to avenge his earlier embarrassment at the hands of Ariarathes V of Cappadocia. Antiochus, the mother of Ariarathes, had for the early years of her marriage failed to provide her husband with any children. Wishing to avoid being cast aside, she had secretly adopted 2 infant boys, who she pretended were her legitimate children. Eventually, Antiochus was able to give birth to a genuine heir, which caused her to confess her deception, and so the false princes were sent away. In 158 BC, one of these illegitimate children, who was called Orofernes, was welcomed into the Seleucid court. Orofernes maintained that he was in fact the rightful heir to the Cappadocian throne, and Demetrius was only too happy to endorse this claim, sensing an opportunity to once again expand Seleucid influence over Cappadocia. In exchange for the promise of 1,000 talents in tribute, this pretender was provided Seleucid military support, and an invasion of Cappadocia was launched. Ariarathes was rapidly defeated and forced to flee to Rome, while Orofernes was installed as the new king. He ruled as a decadent tyrant, forcibly seizing the wealth of his subjects while putting others to death. In Rome, Ariarathes, deliberately dressed like a pauper, appealed to the Senate for the restoration of his throne. An embassy from Orofernes also arrived, offering a crown in tribute to the Republic and requesting a restoration of their alliance. Depending which sources are to be believed, it was ruled either that Ariarathes should be restored or that both men should rule as co-kings. Whatever the case, these were merely empty words, as the Senate made no attempt to enforce their ruling, and Orofernes continued on as king. There was, however, one man who sought to make concrete efforts to oppose the machinations of Demetrius, Attalus II of Pergamon. In 159 BC, Eumenes II had finally died, after nearly 4 decades on the throne. Attalus, his younger brother and heir, who had personally fought Antiochus the Great at Magnesia, was eager to oppose the Seleucid Empire however he could, and he had been greatly distressed by the expulsion of Ariarathes from Cappadocia. If Demetrius could install the false king on the Cappadocian throne, then for Attalus, an appropriate revenge would be to place a pretender on the Seleucid throne. In 157 BC, he found in the city of Smyrna a young man of striking resemblance to Antiochus V Eupator, who claimed to be the younger brother of the dead king, having by some happenstance managed to escape the same fate. Both Diodorus and Polybius consider this story to have been fraudulent. Nevertheless, the teenager, known as Alexander Ballas, was brought to Pergamon, where he was given a diadem and regal insignia, as had been done with Antiochus IV Epiphanes years before. The boy also brought with him a sister named Laodice. Alexander was then sent to reside with Xenophanes, a chieftain in the Taurus Mountains, which formed the border between Pergamene and Seleucid territory. From there the word was spread into Cilicia and Syria that a son of Antiochus IV yet lived, a word which was spread in hushed whispers by the populace of the empire. Demetrius, while he was not a cruel king, nor an incompetent one, was far from beloved. While his Bohemian uncle had regularly wandered the streets of Antioch among the common people, Demetrius had constructed for himself a tower outside of the city where he would spend his days in isolation, drinking and studying Epicurean philosophy. He was a distant and cold ruler who did nothing to earn the affection of the people, and so gradually they began to be swayed against him. In the same year, Ariarathes of Cappadocia, having failed to gain material aid from the Roman Senate, was contacted by Attalus, who summoned him to Pergamon. En route, agents sent by Orofernes attempted to assassinate the deposed monarch, but they were repeatedly foiled. In 156 BC, Ariarathes reached the Pergamene court, where Attalus furnished him with soldiers and bid him to retake the Cappadocian throne. Orofernes was already struggling to maintain control over his kingdom, with his soldiers on the verge of mutiny. So the king plundered the riches of an ancient mountain sanctuary dedicated to Zeus, the ill-gotten gains being used to buy the loyalty of his men. Purchased loyalty is worth little though. Once Ariarathes invaded, Orofernes' men quickly abandoned him, and he was forced to flee back to Antioch. Demetrius made no immediate attempt to undo this reversal, but did welcome Holofernes into his court so that he might be returned to the Cappadocian throne at a future date. The refugee king showed little gratitude towards his benefactor, and, seeing the public discontent against Demetrius, entered into a conspiracy with some of the citizens of Antioch. While Holofernes was not of the Seleucid dynasty, he claimed that he carried royal blood, and therefore he appeared to the conspirators to be a sufficiently suitable replacement for Demetrius. However, this plot was uncovered, which resulted in Holofernes being apprehended and subsequently imprisoned at Seleucia Pieria. While Demetrius had retained his hold over the throne, the discontent in Syria continued to simmer. At this point, the Seleucid Empire had gained a cavalcade of enemies: Rome, Pergamon, and Cappadocia, while lacking any significant allies. However, Egypt, that great historic enemy of the empire, had not shown any overt hostility towards Syria, perhaps due to the personal history between Ptolemy VI and Demetrius. This period of détente was now to be shattered. Demetrius wished to gain control over the Egyptian territory of Cyprus, which, due to its location, represented an ever-present threat to Syria. For the Seleucids, this was not a new ambition, as Antiochus IV had briefly held the island before being compelled to relinquish control in the aftermath of the 6th Syrian War. Demetrius secretly made contact with Archias, the Ptolemaic governor of Cyprus, and offered him the handsome sum of 500 talents, as well as a position in the Seleucid court, if he would betray his liege and surrender the island. Archias agreed to this proposal, but before he could take any action, the scheme was revealed. The governor was arrested and taken to trial, but before he could be convicted, he fashioned a noose out of a curtain rope and hanged himself in his cell. Demetrius's bumbling attempted subterfuge had created for himself yet another powerful enemy. Around 154 BC, a man by the name of Andriscus had begun to rise to prominence in Antioch. His origins are not entirely clear, but he was almost certainly of humble stock, and according to Diodorus Siculus, he had been serving as a mercenary under Demetrius. This Andriscus bore a striking resemblance to Perseus of Macedon, so much so that his comrades jokingly referred to him as the son of Perseus. Seeing for himself a chance at greatness, Andriscus embraced this moniker and publicly declared that he actually was the son of Perseus, and thus the rightful heir to the now defunct Macedonian throne. In Antioch, he spread a fictitious story of his origins, and soon he had amassed a number of followers, with the hoi polloi being eager to support any who would oppose Roman hegemony. Andriscus appealed directly to Demetrius, requesting the support of the king in reclaiming Macedon, but he was dismissed as a madman. Undeterred, this pretender continued to receive enormous support from the common people, and eventually the clamouring mobs demanded that the Seleucid monarch either aid Andriscus or be deposed. Demetrius did not wish to challenge Rome, nor was he in a position to do so, and thus he took an action which finally destroyed whatever last vestiges of faith the Antiochian public had in him. He ordered that Andriscus be arrested and delivered to the Roman Senate. In the eyes of the people of Antioch and of Syria at large, Demetrius was no longer fit to be their king. As for Andriscus, his story by no means ends here, but we will return to the discussion of his life on another occasion. In 153 BC, another old enemy of the Seleucid king made a reappearance. Heraclides had not forgotten the fate which had befallen his brother Timarchus, and had long sought vengeance against Demetrius. Having heard about the enormous discontent in Antioch, he could see that the iron was hot, and that now was the time to strike. Heraclides arrived in Rome, bringing with him Alexander Ballas and Laodice. This delegation was admitted to the Senate House in order to address the great men of Rome. Young Alexander begged them to recall the friendship which had existed between his supposed father, Antiochus IV, and Rome, as, after all, many of the senators present had grown up alongside the king. Next, Heraclides gave an impassioned panegyric in honour of the late monarch. The The delegation was doing its utmost to play on the heartstrings of the Romans, and while Polybius was able to see through this manipulation, most of those present were taken in by it. With the senators enraptured, now Heraclides got to the heart of the matter, asking for Roman recognition of Alexander as the rightful king of Syria, and requesting Roman aid in taking the throne from Demetrius. All of this the Senate agreed to, although the decision was far from unanimous, as at least a few senators were not swayed by Heraclides' rhetoric and doubted the claimed paternity of Alexander. It seems that gaining Roman support was the final piece of the puzzle for Heraclides, as all of the other enemies of Demetrius had fully committed themselves to the cause of Alexander. Thus, the delegation returned triumphantly to Ephesus, where work was immediately begun on assembling an invasion force. No expense was spared in hiring the finest mercenaries of the Greek world, whose services were bought with gold provided by Pergamon, Cappadocia, and Egypt. Demetrius was aware of the coming war and began the process of preparing his own forces for battle, many of whom had to be summoned from the frontiers of the empire. As part of these preparations, he sent two of his sons, Demetrius and Antiochus, along with a good deal of treasure, away to Knidos in Caria, where they could be kept safe in case the worst should happen. The third son, Antigonus, was as yet too young to leave his mother, and so he remained in Antioch. In the spring of 152 BC, the Ptolemaic fleet conveyed Elagabalus and his army to Phoenicia. Presumably the Seleucid navy had not been sufficiently rebuilt following its scuttling by Gnaeus Octavius, and so was incapable of opposing this invasion. Alexander made land at Ptolemais, whose people threw open the gates and welcomed him as a liberator from the by now detested Demetrius. The Seleucid Empire had fallen into a state of civil war. We return once again to the subject of Judea, which now found itself on the frontier of this new conflict. Demetrius desired to withdraw the bulk of his occupation forces from the region, so that they could be used to defend Syria and oppose Alexander. Unilaterally doing so would risk a new Jewish revolt, which could use the state of war as an opportunity for independence. So Demetrius wrote to Jonathan Aphus, inviting him to set up an autonomous nationalist government under Seleucid authority. This would be an enormous concession, but would at least prevent the empire from losing what was seen as a strategically vital piece of territory. Jonathan entered Jerusalem and showed the letter of the king to the garrison of the Acra, who then released a number of hostages who had been held there. All of the Seleucid garrisons were subsequently withdrawn from Judea, save those in the Acra and at Bethsura. Jonathan began making repairs to Jerusalem and set to work building up its defences. Without having to fight a battle, the Maccabees had once again gained power over Judea. Meanwhile, Alexander and his companions saw the accession of an old enemy of Demetrius to power in Jerusalem as an opportunity. The pretender wrote to Jonathan and heaped praise upon the Maccabee for his past acts of courage, and then offered to appoint him as high priest in exchange for an alliance, enclosing with the letter a purple robe and golden diadem. In October of 152 BC, Jonathan donned this uniform and presided over the Feast of the Tabernacles, demonstrating publicly that he had accepted the proposal of Alexander. Demetrius panicked when he heard of this, and once more wrote to Jonathan, this time offering to exempt Judea from all taxation, as well as to withdraw the last of his garrisons from the region. The king also cunningly offered to extend the size of Judea to include Ptolemais itself, among other places, which would then compel the Jews to actively join the war against Alexander. Jonathan and the people of Jerusalem ultimately did not trust Demetrius, instead choosing to maintain their support for the upstart pretender. The details of the rest of the conflict between Demetrius and Elagabalus are largely unknown to us. Justin mentions that Demetrius routed the forces of Alexander in an initial battle, but it is unclear whether this was before or after their diplomatic struggle over Judea. In any case, the decisive battle came in the June of 150 BC. Taking advantage of his naval supremacy, Alexander now attacked Syria directly, landing his army near Seleucia Pieria. Demetrius did not shrink from battle and sallied forth to confront his foe. The two armies met outside of Antioch. On the left wing, Demetrius' soldiers were victorious, but whoever commanded there made a classic mistake, abandoning the battlefield to pursue Alexander's fleeing men and to subsequently plunder their camp, rather than returning to support the rest of the army. Meanwhile, on the right flank, Demetrius led the charge, as was expected of a good Hellenistic monarch. He placed himself in the thick of the fighting and fought valiantly, personally killing many men. When some broke before him, he gave chase on his horse, but this pursuit took him into a swamp where his steed lost its footing and fell. Alexander's men encircled the king and began to rain javelins down upon him. Demetrius, covered in mud and blood, did not give up, but again bravely fought off his assailants. However, the damage had been done, and having suffered many wounds, the king collapsed. Demetrius was in his mid-30s and had reigned for 11 years. Alexander Ballas, that puppet of Attalus and Ptolemy, now took the throne, with Queen Laodice and her youngest son Antigonus being put to death. Demetrius Soter had not been a bad king in the typical understanding of the concept. He was not particularly cruel, he was not particularly self-indulgent, he was not particularly cowardly, and he was not particularly incompetent. However, he was not a charismatic man, and was something of an introvert, preferring isolation, with only the company of scholars and of his close friends. Those closest to him, like the historian Polybius, seemed to have genuinely loved and respected Demetrius, but to the public he came across as an aloof and cold figure. This served to make him unpalatable to a public who desired a return to the days of Antiochus IV, who had been the most outrageous kind of extroverted showman. Unfortunately, the precarious political circumstances which Demetrius inherited forced him to make hard and unpopular choices, which further turned the people against him. However, this does not excuse his repeated failures in the diplomatic arena, although one could argue that the deck was stacked against him, given the pre-existing bias against the dynasty of Seleucus IV by the likes of Rome and Pergamon. Making an enemy of the Ptolemies was the final nail in the coffin, and was the result of an unnecessary piece of intrigue. Even if Demetrius had been successful in acquiring Cyprus, such an act would have surely resulted in war with Egypt, a war which the various enemies of the Seleucid Empire would have joined. Had the king presided over an internally secure state without too many external foes, he could have proven to be a good king, in a similar mould as other more introverted rulers, such as the Roman emperors Claudius and Marcus Aurelius. As it was, Demetrius Soter has gone down in the history books as a mediocre ruler, under whom much of the fracturing of the empire took place. However, the mostly peaceful period of his rule would be looked back upon with envy by those who had to live under his successors. Next time, the pretender Alexander Ballas reigns as king, but the sons of Demetrius wait in the wings for the moment to avenge their father. If you have any comments, criticism, or questions, please post them below, and thank you for listening.